So, well, the object of my study, it's also green. And although it's not extraterrestrial, it can be as mysterious. So as Carolina said, I am a plant ecologist, and as such, I'm interested in what makes alien invasive plants successful invaders in areas where they were not there before. So just I want to show you some examples that you might have seen around, particularly in Berlin. Please let me know if something is wrong, Caro. Okay, so what you see here on the left is Robinia, very common here in Berlin, but also can be found in many places around the world. And the other one is the goldenrod, which is also very common in Berlin and can be found in places like different other cities in Germany. Different species, but this one you can also find it. So they are around us, but what exactly are alien invasive species in general? Oh, wow. Okay, so alien invasive species are plant, but can also be animals, or can be other things like pathogens that have been transported by humans to new areas. And once they are there, they can actually spread without our help. So what happens is that, for example, a species, in this case, say a tree, is introduced to an area because it has some economic value, right? But once it's introduced there, it starts growing, sort of escaping from these areas, and it starts outcompeting the native ones. So from what you see here in this very basic animations, they have very bad impacts on, for example, biodiversity. So my work was in the Southern Hemisphere, actually. So back in South Africa, in the southwestern part of Africa, I worked in this beautiful place. So in this area, you have what is called fynbos vegetation. This is a hotspot of biodiversity, and that means that not only that you have many, many species, many awesome species, as you can see, but also that you can find certain species only in this area, and they don't grow in any other place in the world. So that you can imagine that it's very important to protect them. But unfortunately, in many areas, you might see something like this. So this is the invasion of a plant called acacia. It has been introduced to this area from Australia. And it was introduced for several reasons, but among them, because the wood was an interesting resource, and it was also good because it grew very fast to try to have something growing to avoid degradation in areas. But as you can imagine, just by seeing this picture that is highly dominated by acacias, they have impacts. And in this case, they reduce diversity. They also take more water than the native plants, because the native plants are mostly shrubs and these are trees, so they take way more water, right? And they also make changes in the soil conditions, but I will talk a little bit about that a bit later. So as a plant ecologist, I also wanted to let you know, how do I go about trying to understand how this particular species is invasive in this area? But this is also that the way that we approach the situations in many other systems, not only in fynbos. So usually what you do is you try to find one area that is invaded by the species you're interested in, and then a non-invaded area that should be close by so that you can compare them, but not so close that you might still have the influence of the invasive species. And then you establish what we call plots. So we say, okay, in this area we want to sample, and we can, in my case, for example, I took soil samples because I was interested in the soil conditions, how they might change and help them. And I also recorded the vegetation in each one of these places. So all of this information is very useful to understand how they become invasive. But obviously we don't just collect the data. We have to process this data using our statistical softwares. And then we write manuscripts, papers. These papers are then judged by other scientists who say if they are okay, if our experimental settings or the way we performed the study was correct. So it's it can be very hard many times. These people who are judging our work are our colleagues, but they're not involved in the work, actually, they shouldn't be. And some, like this little one here, can be quite critic, I must say. So, but enough about the data and all of that. And let me tell you a bit of what I found in this system with this acacia species. So acacias are legume trees. That means that they can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere with the help of certain bacteria. And this nitrogen then goes to the leaves and allows them to grow better. But then when the leaves fall to the soil, they decompose, and then this ends up being an increase in the soil nitrogen, which also affects the bacteria that are processing this, right? And all these changes actually help the acacia perform better in this new ecosystem where they did not grow before. And so far that you say, okay, this is more or less okay, but what is the problem? Well, the problem is that this may stay even after we get rid of the acacias, and even prevent us if we want to recover the system, if we want to restore the system. So this is why I find this study is very important. But you might be thinking, and let me stop sharing now, why do we care about this particular species? Why not others? Well, the thing is that if you study a certain species, but in this case, it was one, but it can be a group of species, you can learn all this information that might help you prevent other species from becoming invasive. So for example, in this system, all the information that I gave you was from one particular species, which is called Acacia de Albata. But in South Africa, we have many more acacias. So if we know how they become invasive, we might say, okay, we will not maybe plant these other acacias because they are probably going to perform similarly. So it gives you information that might be helpful for other species. And the second point is that it also allows you to understand what changed in this ecosystem. In particular, for example, the one that I explained that is super beautiful, you might want to say, well, I want to go back to this beautiful system and not have this horrible one that we have now. So this is when restoration comes into play. And it's very important for restoration to understand what changed in this ecosystem. So this is also very useful information you can find from this type of studies. And the third one is that although this species is alien, and we call them alien invasive species, they are actually plants. They occur in other places and many times in very similar communities. So all this information might allow us to understand a bit better how plant communities function in general, how you might see that in a native plant community, some are a bit more abundant than others. So you see them more conspicuous than others. So all this is also important for other aspects. So the more natural, if you want, of the field. So this is my passion for now. I hope it's also yours now. And I look forward to your questions. You can also contact me here in Twitter. And I would also like to thank the people who gave me money here. So I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Flor. That was amazing. I forgot to tell everyone that Flor is actually also part of the Berlin Science Week, the Berlin Soapbox Science team. And whilst we are waiting for questions, please put your questions on the chat. We have some time for questions. Maybe whilst we wait, you could tell us a little bit about, what makes a plant invasive or not? I guess plants are traveling around different environments all the time. What will make a plant invasive or not?
Well, it is true. So as you mentioned, and you can also imagine from the amount of things that we are importing and exporting all the time that, well, some species don't become invasive. And this is also a very interesting part of our field, where some scientists are trying to understand, well, why is the species around and it's not really spreading, it stays there. We actually don't know for all of them. In some cases, we know, for example, that there might not be so much genetic diversity, and so they are not they're not able to adapt to the changing circumstances, for example. But in other species, we just don't know. It's a mystery. So it's also why it's interesting to study as well the ones that are alien, but not invasive. So they're not spreading still. They are in the place where they were introduced and they stay there.
Fascinating. Okay, we have a question in the chat. We have several questions. You ended on the topic restoration. Do you think efforts to eradicate acacians in South Africa, I think,
yes,
are feasible? Africa. What would be necessary to eradicate successfully? And are you saying it is better to try to adapt?
That's a very good question. I would say that any effort is very good. And they have a very big program called Working for Water, which is one of my funders. So they have programs where they train people to clear the acacias and other invasive species, not just acacias. And I mean, it is very important to do it because, as I mentioned, they take way more water. And I don't know if many of you remember, but a couple of years ago in South Africa, we were very worried because water was not enough and we had to limit it a lot. So there's a study that have calculated that if we get rid of all the invasive trees in these areas of South Africa where the water was very problematic, we could actually get up to 30% more water. So imagine, it's worth the effort. But as everything, it's a matter of money. So how much money are you willing to input into this? So I would say a lot, but politicians maybe don't agree all the time.
Maybe a good follow-up from this question is, are there examples? So Marta asks, has someone found a strategy to restore a land that has been covered by acacia already? Has there been some successful stories?
Yes. So much of the areas that I had in my study as reference, so the ones that were not invaded were actually invaded very, very long ago, and they have been cleared successfully. So they look beautiful, but this is not always the case. Sometimes you take them out, and then you may have to try to help them a little bit, or for example, plant some species, or maybe work on the soil conditions. So it can happen. Yes, there are very good examples, but in some other places, this is not so easy.
Okay, maybe one last question from Liliana. I assume that every country will have their own invasive species. What would be the country affected the most?
Good question. So, well, the thing is that in low-income countries, sometimes you have more problems. So it's not about how much more it is impacted, but if you have, for example, a species that is covering areas that are essential for people, for farmers, then it's very problematic, especially in areas that are not so industrialized. So in Berlin, you might see them around, but you can imagine that they might have some impacts, but it's not as bad as an area where farmers cannot produce anymore because it's covered with some alien species. Although I must say that there's one that is highly allergenic, and it's invasive to Berlin as well. So that is actually not so good. But I would say that I cannot really answer which country is more impacted, but I would say that some are more impacted because the most important economic activities there.
Thank you so much, Flor. Perfect timing.